Mr. Chairman, I think it's a very, very good bill, and I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered as read. No amendment to the bill is in order except those printed in House Report 113-339. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered by a member designated in the report, shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It's now in order to consider amendment number 1 printed in House Report 113-339. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1 printed in House Report number 113-339, offered by Mr. Hastings of Washington.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Mr. Chairman, this amendment makes several technical and clarifying changes to the bill and conforms the bill text to which was favorably reported from the Committee on Natural Resources. Let me cite just some of these small changes in the amendment. It includes a saving provision regarding the effect of the Act on Indian tribes' treaty or other recognized rights. It clarifies that. It also provides clearer language that the provision of opportunities to hunt, fish, and shoot on certain federal lands, and I'll quote, shall not authorize or facilitate commodity development, use or extraction, motorized vehicle access, road construction, or maintenance or use not otherwise allowed under the Wilderness Act. That clarifies that. It also incorporates an amendment filed by our colleague, the sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Latta, to Title VII of the bill to correct a sunset date for the existing advisory council. So as I understand, the manager's amendment is something that has been vetted, and I urge its adoption, and I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserved. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Yield myself such time as I may consume.
Is the gentleman claim the time in opposition?
I am, although in the end I won't. I am.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Now, I appreciate there are some clarifications in this amendment which we do support, but there are a few remaining oversights. There was an amendment by Del Bene and Kilmer from Washington State that specified that tribal jurisdiction is not to be infringed upon, where this language is not the this blanket language in the Hastings Amendment protecting tribal rights could well not be read. We're supposedly in a number of places here we're chasing chimeras, is that the pronunciation? Illusions, threats with some of the provisions about the film permitting and that. But this might be real, which is, this does not deal with the potential for disputes between tribes and neighboring landowners or between tribes, and so therefore it would have been better to have the broader language of Del Bene and Kilmer, which specified treaty-protected rights of the individual tribal members are protected, whereas this amendment only protects the rights of the tribe itself. So I worry that we're creating a loophole here that doesn't adequately protect the sovereignty of tribes and all of their members. The amendment does attempt to address some of the wilderness issues in Title VII, the so-called Recreational Fishing and Hunting Heritage Act, which fails to address the wilderness issues in Title III. Filming on public lands, we've already had extensive discussion of that. No identified problem, no hearing. Nobody's ever said we need this, but it's in there. We're going to allow mechanized film crews into wilderness areas. And then Title VII creates a loophole that will allow motorized equipment and vehicles into federal wilderness areas, now not with permanent roads, with only temporary roads or driving off-road, to facilitate hunting in wilderness areas or otherwise restricted areas, wildlife refuges and that, and we still find that very problematic. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington.
I urge adoption of the amendment, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Washington. All those in favor will say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 2, printed in the House Report 113-339. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in House Report number 113-339, offered by Mr. Hanna of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Hanna, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you. I rise today in strong support of the SHARE Act and am pleased to be a sponsor of this bill. The SHARE Act allows more Americans to enjoy outdoor hobbies such as hunting, fishing, and recreational shooting on public lands. Not only do these activities provide our constituents with enjoyable hobbies and pastimes, they also contribute to our communities by creating and supporting diverse jobs in every congressional district. When families travel in activities in the outdoors, they spur demand for outdoor products and services and create jobs in the manufacturing, outfitting, retail, lodging, and hospitality industries. I am proud that the village of Ilion in my congressional district is home to our nation's oldest continually operating manufacturing company, Remington Arms. Remington manufactures firearms for hunting and recreational shooting and sustains more than 1,400 well-paying union jobs in New York's Mohawk Valley. Legislators in Washington and in Albany should take concrete steps to support these private sector jobs and not threaten them. And I am pleased the House is taking this action today. By opening new lands for recreational use and by making the joys of outdoors more accessible to average Americans, we can assist important sectors of our economy without spending taxpayer dollars. My amendment would simply quantify the economic impacts of this act by detailing how the new recreational opportunities it provides will create jobs, boost wages, and generate new local, state, and federal revenue. It is my hope that by highlighting the connection between sportsman-friendly federal policy and growth in outdoor industries, future Congresses will take additional steps to not only provide our constituents with greater access to hunting, fishing, shooting, and conservation pursuits, but also help grow jobs in the private sector and support these American traditions.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes. Thank you, sir.
I want to congratulate the gentleman on offering this amendment. I think putting this aspect into this bill, I think will help quantify how important hunting and fishing is if you put an economic component to it. So I congratulate the gentleman, and I plan to support the amendment, and I yield back to the gentleman.
I have reserved the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
I rise to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I believe that the information on the economic impacts of conservation is important. It is something that we don't quantify very well. As we pointed out earlier, some of the provisions of this Act, unfortunately, will fly in the face of conservation that benefits hunting and fishing activities on public lands. So I think actually, on balance, the gentleman's requirement here would be very helpful, to help in the future for land managers who have to make decisions between opening up lands to mining or to oil and gas development versus the benefits the community could realize from or has been realizing or will continue to realize from the recreation, hunting, and fishing would be useful information. Federal lands have become essentially a reservoir, a place where these activities are protected for the most part from development, with the exceptions of what I mentioned earlier. And, you know, they are some of the premier destinations for hunting and fishing in the country. And again, the chairman and I disagree over the merits of acquiring some of these lands, which are, you know, in now private ownership from willing sellers that potentially will otherwise be slated for development, and using Land Water Conservation Fund. I believe that addressing the Land Water Conservation Fund proactively would have been useful. But for certain, given the objections to that, because it has not yet quite expired, even though we're underutilizing it and using the tax dollars somewhere else, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act has expired. Dingell-Whitman amendment was proposed to reauthorize that critical program, and that was not allowed. And so, you know, that would also be something that would show a measurable benefit. With that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
The balance of his time. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I urge my colleagues to support this amendment to qualify and quantify the economic impact of the SHARE Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It's now time to consider amendment number 3, printed in House Report 113-339. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in House Report number 113-339, offered by Mr. Castro of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to Chairman Hastings and Ranking Member DeFazio for considering this amendment. This amendment concerns the composition of the Hunting Heritage Conservation Council Committee, which will advise the Secretaries of Agriculture and the Interior on policies and programs related to hunting and recreational activities on federal lands. More specifically, the amendment adds a requirement that women and minority hunting and fishing advocacy, outreach, or education organizations are included as discretionary committee members. Examples of such groups include the Women's Hunting and Sporting Foundation, Hispanics Enjoying Camping, Hunting, and Outdoors Organization, and the African American Hunting Organization. This will bring the number of groups in that discretionary committee group to 14 from 12. The groups that I am adding with this amendment were originally included in the committee's charter. This amendment simply codifies their inclusion. I'm proud to offer the amendment to reflect a diverse perspective on America's land use. I yield back my time. I certainly will.
I thank the gentleman for offering this amendment, and I think that his amendment, since the idea of the whole underlying legislation is to expand as much as we can to those that want to enjoy that, I think his amendment adds to the legislation, and I'm prepared to support it, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. Yield back.
Thank you, Chairman, very much.
Will the gentleman yield?
I certainly will, Ranking Member.
I thank the gentleman, and I want to congratulate him on his diligence and his foresight here to propose this amendment. It was an oversight in replacing the current council with a new membership. I'm not exactly certain why we need to do that, because we haven't heard particular complaints. But in any case, this is an improvement upon the newly recommended council to include minorities and women fully engaged, since I see a lot of those folks out in the back country in my state, and I'm sure you do in Texas too. So I'm pleased for one brief moment here we have a bipartisan consensus. With that, I congratulate the gentleman. Thank you.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, both. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition in opposition? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 4, printed in House Report 113-339. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Are printed in House Report Number 113-339, offered by Mr. Gallego of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gallego, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, would like to thank the chairman and the ranking member for their work on this legislation. I can think of nothing more important that all of us, I think, agree on than the importance of taking care of our veterans and our veterans community. Especially now, we have so many wounded warriors coming back and so many groups that have taken to outdoors activities as part of the therapy for wounded warriors, and making sure that we really approach making them whole again in a very real way. And nature is a huge part of that. Last night, in fact, this chamber held a moment of silence to honor veterans in Afghanistan and Iraq. These are folks who have put their country above all else. And what this amendment specifically would do would be to essentially correct what I believe also was an oversight in ensuring that veterans are also included in this Wildlife Hunting Heritage Conservation Council Advisory Committee. And again, it is because so many veterans groups now and so many places are popping up where the outdoors is a great part of that therapy and a very important part of the therapy that many of our wounded warriors are receiving. In this advisory committee, as they give their advice to the administration, it's important that they do so with the veteran at the table. It's important that veterans have that voice, and they look at it with the perspective from a wounded warrior, a veteran, someone who has served our country in uniform. What is it that we can be doing to make this experience more meaningful for them? And I appreciate, again, the opportunity very much.
Would the gentleman yield?
To offer the amendment.
Would the gentleman yield?
Absolutely, I'm happy to yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I want to say that this amendment, I believe, also will add to the underlying legislation, which, of course, to expand the experience of hunting and fishing. And so the remarks I made to his colleague from Texas, I think, is applicable also to this. So I endorse this amendment and tell my friend from Oregon, the ranking member, that's 2 for 2 now, and I'll yield back to the gentleman.
Would the gentleman yield?
Absolutely.
Well, I'd like to, Texas is batting 100 here today. I would like to thank the gentleman for improving the proposed composition of the council. I thought your points about the healing that can come from wounded warriors being in, these precious natural areas in our country is very well taken, and I appreciate that. Just not to create any discord at the moment, but there was another amendment that wasn't allowed, and that isn't the purview of the gentleman with the bill on the floor today, but by the Rules Committee that would have, by Representative Weiss, which would have waived recreation fees for veterans with disabilities, and I hope we can revisit that issue in the future. But I congratulate the gentleman on his improvement and his recognition of our veterans.
Thank you very much.
Does the gentleman yield back the balance of his
I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks opposition, time in opposition? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 5, printed in House Report 113-339.
As a designee of Mr. Ellison, I have an amendment at the desk. Mr. Ellison is detained at the White House.
It's now in order to consider amendment number 6, printed in House Report 113-339.
Which one is he, 5 or 6?
For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Okay, well, I'm confused. Which one is
number 6?
Okay, because this says number 24. Okay, all right. Now, I would repeat what I said previously. The
gentleman will suspend.
I have an amendment at the desk
as designee.
As a designee of Mr. Ellison, who's detained at the White House, I ask unanimous consent to proceed with the amendment.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in House Report number 113-339, offered by Mr. DeFazio of Oregon.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon.
I want to applaud Congressman Ellison for bringing this amendment to the attention of the House. We have had endless debate about the appropriate role of the National Environmental Policy Act in both Resources Committee and the House Committee on Transportation. The underlying bill, 3590, includes language which would eliminate the need for the Fish and Wildlife Service to disclose, analyze, and take comments on decisions related to management decisions in national wildlife refuges. Let me repeat that. They would not have to analyze or take comments from either side on decisions that relate to management decisions in national wildlife refuges. Never has there been a case made here during the lead-up to this bill, such as there was, and during the debate, why we need this very broad NEPA exception, which would, if they wanted to increase hunting, no NEPA analysis. They want to decrease hunting, no NEPA analysis. No opportunity for the public to be involved in the process. And as we learned during the shutdown, the wildlife refuge system provides a tremendous opportunity, some of it very ephemeral in terms of seasons for duck hunters, fishermen, and other sportsmen and women across the country. In some densely populated areas, like in Congressman Thompson's district, wildlife refuges are some of the only hunting areas open to the public, and especially the disabled public. Why do we need to cut the public out, including disabled Americans, veterans, anybody, regarding these special places and their management when no evidence has been presented that NEPA is in any way an impediment to refuge management? It's just the standard boilerplate, repeal NEPA anywhere, everywhere, all the time, and maybe sooner or later it might stick, but it won't, given the veto threat on this bill and the fact that the Senate isn't going to act on it. But anyway, it's in here. And then there was an amendment to be offered by Congressman Brown from Georgia, which I was going to strongly support, which would have fixed the bill and probably brought a fair number of votes across the aisle by stripping these extraneous provisions regarding NEPA and wilderness and everything that's under attack in this bill that doesn't need to be under attack in this bill. But I guess somehow, even though it was made in order, the Republican side has convinced him not to offer the amendment because it would have passed and it would have made the bill better. At this point, at least we could support the Ellison amendment as it relates to national wildlife refuges. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purposes the gentleman from California seek recognition? I'm sorry, from Washington seek recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Well, Mr. Chairman, I guess all good things come to an end because I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment. And I oppose this amendment because it undermines what I consider to be a fundamental purpose of the law. The fundamental purpose that we are here today is to protect our hunting and fishing traditions on federal lands. We are making a clear statement that hunting and fishing are important use of our multiple-use federal lands. This bill establishes a clear policy that federal lands should be open for hunting and fishing unless specifically closed by a transparent and open federal process. Let me repeat that, Mr. Chairman, that federal lands should be open for hunting and fishing unless specifically closed by a transparent and open federal process. NEPA requires preparation of an environmental impact statement when the federal agency proposes to take major federal action. When H.R. 3590 is enacted into law, There will be no need for a costly and bureaucratic process currently necessary to make lands available for hunting and fishing. That process won't be necessary because it will be the law. Congress has spoken as to what the law is. Again, this bill is designed to set out an open, unless specifically closed process on BLM and Forest Service lands. As a result, no major federal action would be needed or would take place to keep these lands open to these traditional important uses of our shared federal lands. And if there is no administrative action, there is no need for an EIS or NEPA review. However, H.R. 3598 conforms an established understanding of the law that should an agency move to close federal lands, the agency should then undertake an open and public process before having the lands closed to our traditional uses. Now, we know that these provisions are important because they fix a court-created problem regarding the implementation of the 1997 National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act. We have seen the clear track record that anti-hunter groups will use to tie up hunting and fishing access to federal lands with endless lawsuits. This bill reverses this trend and makes our lands open for hunting and fishing. Again, Mr. Chairman, we are making a policy statement that this will be what the law of the land is. H.R. 3598 directs that our conservation dollars be spent on conservation activities in the field rather than on redundant paperwork and, of course, endless lawsuits. That is the goal of the bill that this amendment would undercut, which would undercut our goal of promoting hunting and fishing, and I urge the defeat of the amendment, and I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves his time.
I yield back.
The gentleman from Oregon yields back. The gentleman from Washington.
I urge defeat of the amendment, and I yield back my time.
Question on the amendment is offered by the gentleman from Oregon. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Who has it? In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 7, printed in the House Report 113-339. For what purpose does the gentleman from Missouri seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 7, printed in House Report Number 113-339, offered by Mr. Smith of Missouri.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, and a member opposing each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For my opportunity to present this amendment to H.R. 3590 today, the Sportsman Heritage and Recreational Enhancement Act. As a member of the Natural Resources Committee, I couldn't be prouder of the work that we have done to continue to protect our sportsmen's ability to enjoy the outdoors. As such, I'm honored to offer my amendment that would ensure that sportsmen will continue to be able to use motorized vessels in the Ozark National Scenic Riverways, a national park contained wholly within my congressional district in southern Missouri. The Ozark National Scenic Riverways is a popular destination in Missouri for fishing, gigging, and trapping. These activities have traditionally been undertaken by individuals and families for generations. An economy has arisen in my district, selling boats and motors and other products to folks who want to gig, fish, and trap within the rivers. Recently, the National Park Service has been discussing closing down areas of the park to motorized vessels and further limiting the horsepower of these vessels in other areas. The reduction of boat motor horsepower would limit the number of folks who could be on a boat and restrict access to families. Banning motorized vessels from areas of the park where they are currently allowed would further restrict the public's use and enjoyment of the park. Banning motorized vessels would also exclude groups from using the river that simply have no other options, like the elderly and disabled veterans. Why would the Park Service resort to such drastic measures to block activities that are currently allowed? One explanation is that they don't want folks to be able to utilize the river like they have for the past decades. My amendment would simply preserve the current park regulations as they are now and how they've been for the last 5 decades, preventing the Park Service from regulating sportsmen off the river. The Ozark National Scenic Riverways was created for the enjoyment of the public, and it should stay with the public.
Would the gentleman yield?
I do.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say that I think this amendment is in the spirit of the underlying legislation, which is to make sure that there is access for hunting and fishing. And here we have, as I said in my opening statement, the potential of bureaucratic malaise, I guess, slowing down access to this particular area that the gentleman from Missouri represents. I think his amendment adds a great deal to this legislation, and I intend to support it, and I yield back to the gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you. Thank you.
I reserve your time.
I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
I certainly am not an expert on the gentleman's district and what the exact issue is here. However, I do know that there has been a proposed management plan that's been out for comment since November 8th. It will close on Friday. I would hope that the gentleman and concerned parties on either side of the issue have all weighed in to comment, because what we're doing here today, this bill will not become law. It's already guaranteed a veto threat. The addition of this to the bill will not help resolve what is a local issue where the Park Service has to weigh comments from motorized users and non-motorized users, and then come to a conclusion weighing those comments and put forward a new management plan. That's the way this is going to get done. Shouldn't be done from Washington, D.C., shouldn't be dictating. If we get into every individual land use or access decision being made by every unit of the Park Service, every unit of our, of the Fish and Wildlife Service and their refuges, and every unit of the Forest Service and every unit of the BLM, we're going to be pretty busy and be embroiled in a lot of local controversy. This, I believe, is it's premature in that comment closes this week, and the process will come to a conclusion. Comments will be weighed, and a decision will be put out for final comment. And it's also, at this point, being added to a bill that's going nowhere. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield to, yes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I just want to clarify something, Mr. Chairman, has been said here by my friend, the ranking member, that the administration has issued a veto threat. They have not issued a veto threat. They have said, and I'll just read the last line of their statement of administration policy. It says, the administration looks forward to working with Congress to enact sportsman and recreation legislation that addresses the concerns raised with certain provisions of H.R. 3590. Now, in the letter, they do say they have problems with 4 of the 8 titles, but to simply suggest that the administration has issued a veto threat on this is simply not correct. And I ask well, I'll let it go, and I yield back to the gentleman.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Missouri. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 8, printed in House Report 1113-339. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 8, printed in House Report Number 113-339, offered by Mr. Crawford of Arkansas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Crawford, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas.
Thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume. My amendment will provide a limited exemption related to the taking of migratory game birds over farm fields. In short, it clarifies a recent interpretation by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about what constitutes a baited field. In 2012, the agency warned rice growers that some of their fields that had been rolled, as farmers often do after the harvest to prepare the field to be planted the next spring, could be off limits to waterfowl hunting. That summer's drought led to an early rice harvest in several parts of the country, and heavy rainfall then caused a rare secondary ratoon crop to sprout. The Fish and Wildlife Service cautioned that should rice heads emerge in those fields, their guidelines stated that in any field work such as rolling would make it a baited field where waterfowl hunting would be unlawful. Waterfowl hunting is a vital industry in my state. Hunters come from the world over to Arkansas's 1st District, and farmers, small businesses, and the rural communities that dot the Delta all rely on the millions of dollars hunters bring with them every year. My amendment is a common-sense solution that simply states that a field may not be considered baited as a result of normal agricultural practices, as determined by the State Office of the Cooperative Extension Service at the request of the Secretary of Interior, with concurrence from that state's Fish and Wildlife Service. I ask for your support for this important amendment that will protect farmers from being punished for simply carrying out long-recognized and responsible agricultural practices. With that, I recognize the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I plan to support his amendment. But this is something that seems like we wrestle with all the time here on the federal level. There's uniqueness when you're on the ground, but yet we write rules and regulations of a one-size-fits-all. This is clearly a unique situation, and I think the gentleman's amendment clarifies that very well. And I support the amendment, and I yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
To oppose the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
You know, we often have conflicts. In Oregon, we had a very substantial conflict relating to geese and in terms of farmers' fields. And the resolution was that the birds protected by the Migratory Bird Act would continue to be protected, but farmers would be able to hunt with the state license, and I don't know about the gentleman's state whether or not state license would be required, the birds that were not migratory, that were becoming pests and were resident in order to protect their crops. And this substantially resolved the problem. I don't know if a similar fix would work here, but an amendment that gives an open license on the Migratory Bird Act, which has international implications, the Migratory Bird Treaty, seems to me to be an extreme measure in this case, and therefore we would oppose the amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time.
I reserve.
From Arkansas is recognized. The gentleman yields back.
Did you want to say anything?
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arkansas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 9, printed in House Report 113-339. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 9, printed in House Report Number 113-339, offered by Mr. Fleming of Louisiana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Fleming, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume. My amendment today maintains the state of Louisiana's ability to regulate hunting within its borders. In a decision announced March 1st, 2012, the Forest Service Regional Forester, located way over in Atlanta, Georgia, went over the heads of the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries and the Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries Commission to forever prohibit the use of dogs to hunt deer in Kisatchie National Forest. Deer hunting has a long and important cultural history within the state of Louisiana. When French settlers first came to Louisiana in the 18th century, thickets and dense timber covered the area. Most of these settlers had companion dogs with them, and the most treasured companions were the deer hounds. The use of dogs helped hunters drive the deer from the woods onto trails, and the plentiful herds provided exciting sport and sound nourishment. The 600,000-acre Kisatchie National Forest has provided diverse hunting opportunities for decades, including the use of dogs in hunting a variety of animals. Oddly enough, the regional forester does not prohibit the use of dogs for hunting raccoon, squirrel, rabbit, and game birds. The dog deer season in Louisiana has been severely restricted in recent years, down from 15 days to 7 days in 2012. And dog deer hunting in the Kisatchie has been limited to certain ranger districts. According to communication with the Forest Service, even southern states allow hunting in the 7 southern states allow hunting in the national forest within their borders. They include Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Louisiana. However, this is the first time the Forest Service has issued a ban on dog deer hunting or hunting deer with dogs within a specific state. According to the Forest Service documents, the revenue generated from dog deer hunting, including the care of animals, contributes approximately 18 to 29 direct jobs and results in roughly $890,000 to $1.4 million of income from hunting tourism and related activities. By the Forest Service's own assessment, it is likely that economic benefits are currently being lost as hunters leave the area to pursue the sport elsewhere. This is having a tangible economic impact on our state, robbing it of even more jobs. I would like to emphasize that the state of Louisiana, the Kennel Club, and Safari Club International support my amendment, and a similar amendment was accepted by the House with a voice vote last Congress. I urge support of this amendment, and I reserve. Yes, sir.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I think this is a good amendment, and I do support the amendment. The primary purpose of this legislation is to limit unjustified federal bureaucratic limitations on hunting and fishing. And I also want to make a point here also. It's important to recognize that the authority of states to regulate hunting and fishing should be paramount over the federal government. Individual federal agencies should not preempt state laws. It sounds to me like that's what the gentleman is talking about in his case. I think the amendment is a good amendment. I support it, and I yield back to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
I rise to speak in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
We've talked about major problems confronting this Congress, and here we are now trying to resolve yet another local conflict. After considerable complaints by private property owners about hunters encroaching on their land to retrieve their dogs who had gotten lost, driving on their land and that, the Forest Service decided, because of the intermingled ownership, to prohibit the dog deer hunting. Now come the gentleman who says, well, we're going to reopen it, we will countermand the locally made decision, but we will have a new process where the private landowners can petition the Secretary to reclose certain areas of the area that are now closed that he's reopening because of conflicts with their private property. However, these private property owners' petitions will have to go through the dreaded NEPA process, and that is, for deciding something as minor as that, kind of problematic. I guess that maybe we should have a special day here where, and I got some beefs with some federal agencies ongoing that I'd like to settle with legislation too. Maybe we should just have an open amendment process someday where every little local issue we've been dealing with a federal agency, which is contentious between conflicting users, will be decided by the United States Congress in Washington, D.C., not at the local level. That's what we're doing here. It's pretty extraordinary. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to address issues brought up here. First of all, the gentleman said that there were multiple complaints, and this was studied considerably. There was 1,237 responses to a request in 2009, and by October 6th, we found that there were 77%, a clear majority of the respondents who were actually in favor of continuing the practice of dog deer hunting. This was requested again in 2011. There were over 1,300 respondents, and all but 16 comments were in favor of dog deer hunting and against the Forest Service proposed ban. The other thing I'd like to address, Mr. Chairman, is this was not a locally made decision. This was made in Atlanta. Okay, this is the problem. This has been going on for 300 years in the state of Louisiana. It's a big part of our heritage, and somebody over in Georgia, in Atlanta, representing the federal government, made this decision, not locally. There was no decision locally. The state supports this. The local residents support it by a vast majority, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I would yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And in closing, I'd like to just say again, the people of Louisiana want to see this Forest Service ban overturned. This was a decision made outside of our borders. In effect, if you will, even though the people of Louisiana were asked and they gave the correct answer, it was ignored in the decision made by someone outside of our borders. This was a decision made by somebody, again, in Atlanta, a federal employee interfering with a local issue. This is a tradition that goes back, again, 300 years, and I think it's pretty obvious that the people of Louisiana support the continuance of hunting deer with dogs. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The committee will rise informally to receive a message.
The House will be in order. The Chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate agreed to the report of the Committee of Conference to H.R. 2642, cited as the Federal Agricultural Reform and Risk Management Act of 2013.
The committee will resume its sitting.
It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 10, printed in the House Report 113-339. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 10, printed in House Report Number 113-339, offered by Mr. Holt of New Jersey.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chairman recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
I thank the chairman. Sportsmen are among the first to notice the effects of our changing climate. As changes in seasonal distribution of game and diminished natural habitats become more evident. As the climate continues to change, we will experience worse drought, flood, wildfire, and extreme weather events. For public lands and recreation there, climate change will mean changes in hunting seasons, migratory patterns, the native and invasive species populations. We will experience sea level rise, wildfire, drought, and other manifestations of climate change. All of these are altering the landscape and changing the existing opportunities for hunting, fishing, and recreation on public lands. These should be considered. These will have a greater effect on sportsmen, on fishers and hunters than all of the other things we've been talking about today. More than 75% of the federal lands are open now for recreational hunting, fishing, and shooting, but climate change would transform irreversibly, in fact, is transforming irreversibly our public lands in ways that will limit the ability of sportsmen to enjoy the recreational activities in these areas. So this amendment says the department should consider those things. In fact, it's even more limited than that. It says nothing will prevent the department from considering these things. That's what this amendment is. I would hope that the House will accept this. I've been joined by a number of members of the House Sustainable and Energy Coalition in offering this amendment. It is supported by Defenders of Wildlife and the Wilderness Society and the Sierra Club and the Natural Resources Defense Council. I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves. Purpose, does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Mr. Chairman, the primary purpose of this underlying legislation is the premise that federal lands should be open for hunting and fishing recreation rather than being closed. I believe this should be the policy of all of our multiple-use federal lands. The default option should be open, regardless of whether your interests are mountain biking, rock climbing, hunting, fishing, logging, building a solar energy facility, mining, wind power, or developing oil gas. Our nation's multiple-use lands were designed to be used for the benefit of the nation. This open before closed concept is the foundation of what we are trying to do through this legislation. We are trying to raise the bar of bureaucracy that the bureaucracy has placed between hunters and the outdoors. Reckless disregard of our nation's hunting and fishing traditions means too often our federal lands are closed off arbitrarily and not just without public input, but against the public's sentiment. Now the gentleman is proposing that we give the Secretary another new tool to close lands without scientific decision-making, without accounting for their actions. The gentleman proposes that we simply grant the Secretary the sole authority to dictate that we close off any and all of our nation's lands from hunting and fishing based simply on the Secretary's mere opinion that hunting and fishing are a threat to our nation's land because of climate change. Hunting and fishing are traditions and foundations that this nation was built upon. They are not burdens to our national lands. They are one of the many purposes for our national lands. Now, just yesterday, Mr. Chairman, before the Rules Committee, one of my Democrat colleagues was commenting that he had a BB gun at age 7, a .22 rifle at age 12. He talked about how, as a young man, he learned to respect guns and traditions. Yet that same member is concerned about what children are learning today and the lack of respect for guns and the traditions of the outdoors. Mr. Chairman, I believe that this is one of the many benefits and reasons that we are here today to help restore the opportunity for hunting and fishing traditions to take root in our federal lands. To remind our federal land managers that the exercise of these traditions are not a burden on our lands, but one of the foundations of our lands. Finally, let me say this. Regardless of one's view on our climate, this amendment is not about climate change. It's about granting the Secretary a blank check to ban hunting and fishing. Nothing in the bill changes the Secretary's ability to manage our lands to ensure responsible management. The bill does require lands to be open, however, before close, but when closing lands, the Secretary must act in a measured fashion to ensure that our hunting and fishing traditions are protected and valued. So I urge my colleagues to reject what I consider to be an anti-hunting and fishing amendment, and I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
May I ask the time remaining on each side?
from New Jersey has 3 minutes. The gentleman from Washington has 1.5 minutes.
I thank the chair. And I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman who represents Northern Virginia, who, as a leader of the Sustainable Energy and Environment Caucus, is a co-sponsor of this amendment.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chair and I thank my colleague. As the co-chair of the Green Dogs of the Sikh Caucus, I rise in support of this amendment and proud to co-sponsor it. The bill before us purports to be about expanding opportunities for sportsmen on federal lands, yet it fails to recognize the significant effect climate change will have on such opportunities. For example, what will climate change mean for hunters who are forced away from parks because of drought or threat of wildfire? As we witnessed this year, wildfire seasons are now longer, larger, and longer term than ever before because of climate change. The migratory patterns of ducks, and for that matter, the patterns of fish, to name just 2 species, are also being negatively affected. What will climate change mean for anglers who find streams drying up and killing fish? Last September, Montana officials closed the Blackfoot River. Not the Secretary, they did. The iconic backdrop for the book and film, A River Runs Through It, to protect fish from the stress of low-level river flows. Mr. Chairman, if we really want to protect and expand outdoor recreational opportunities, shouldn't we understand what climate change will mean not only for hunters, but for the affected wildlife and their habitat? I urge my colleagues to support this simple, common-sense amendment, and I yield back to my friend from New Jersey.
The gentleman yields back.
I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington.
I reserve my time, and I advise my friend I have no request for time, and I'm prepared to yield back. The gentleman is prepared to yield back.
I will claim the remaining time just to address a couple of points that my friend, the chair from Washington, has raised. There is nothing in this amendment that gives the Secretary any new authority. It simply says that the Secretary should consider climate change in policies for managing these lands. Climate change is the problem that needs to be addressed. You can deny it all you want, but climate change will do more to restrict hunting and fishing and recreation on public lands than these imagined administrative reductions or restrictions or lawsuits or restrictions on lead shot or any of those things. There are a variety of adaptation strategies to promote resilience of fish and wildlife populations and forests and plant communities and freshwater resources and ocean resources. These are being studied by academic and scientific and, yes, government and nonprofit organizations. A great deal of thought is going into this, and we want to make sure that there is nothing that restricts the Secretary from using these best adaptation strategies, these best management practices, to take into account what is real. It is not imagined. The climate is changing. It is affecting the ecology of all of these public lands. I urge support of this amendment.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I yield myself the balance of the time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to point out that the gentleman wanted to clarify by saying this doesn't give authority, but the Secretary should consider. But what if the Secretary considers under current law and then decides to take action? That is the point of the argument that I made. And that is that that action then on climate change could cause limited or no access to our public lands. That's why I said this amendment is kind of cloaked in different clothing, because it does not speak to climate change. In fact, it speaks to the potential closing of our public lands. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on the amendment, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on that I ask a recorded vote.
What do you say for recorded? Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey will be postponed. It is now in order to consider the amendment number 11 printed in House Report 113-339.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to act as a designee of Mr. Kildee, and I have an amendment in the rule under the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 11, printed in House Report number 113-339, offered by Mr. Polis of Colorado.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.